There we go. I think we're recording. All right, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on our Halloween edition of the Honors Colloquium Series here in the fall of 2024. Very exciting and very festive. So today we are very happy to welcome my colleague from the English program, Dr. Jenni DeBie. Jenni did her PhD in University College Cork in literature and is going to be talking today on Mary Shelley and Vampirism, Unmortal Monster. So I'm going to turn it over to her, and then we should have some time for questions and such like at the end. So yeah, Dr. DeBie, please come on down. I'll get out of the way because you don't need to be seeing things. Thank you.
All right, guys, welcome. So before we get to Mary Shelley, my girl, I did my entire PhD on Mary Shelley. We could make this a very long presentation, but I'll try to keep it in the time frame. We have to lay some groundwork on the time that she's writing in, on these what is happening with the vampire art. Why is it not button?
Oh, you have to click on the screen first. Sorry.
Trying to seamlessly transition slides. There we go.
That was good.
All right. Okay, so what was going on with vampires at this time? Mary Shelley is born in 1797, but before we get there, vampires had crawled out of myth and legend in Eastern Europe. We don't even actually know for sure the origin of the word vampire itself. One of the popular theories, I guess you might call it, is that it comes from the Turkish hubir, which means witch, and that it slowly was taken over by this creature. What we do know is that most cultures have some version of the vampire as we know it. There are lots of cultures that have a blood-sucking humanoid monster that comes in the night. We've got the Striga out of Albania. We've got the, let me butcher some Greek here, as someone very loudly gets ice. Some Verkolakas out of Greece. We've got the Strigoi out of Romania. These are just some out of Eastern European. Do you have a drink yet? I'm sorry, dude. There we go. Okay. All right.
It's like a band-aid. Just gotta pull it off.
You just gotta pull it off.
Gotta pull it off.
All right.
Go sweet. And the others.
Striga and the others. So we've got lots of cultures that have these blood-sucking monsters. We also have some quote-unquote scientific evidence of vampires, specifically the disease tuberculosis, lent a lot of credence to the vampire myth. Tuberculosis makes you real pale, makes you real thin. It's what we call a wasting disease. It's why it's also called consumption at this time period. No, you interrupted. Thank you. All right. Tuberculosis, consumption, this wasting disease. And if one person in a household gets TB, quite frequently other members of the household will get TB because it is very, very communicative, right? If anyone's breathing the same air, they're probably going to catch it. And so it's really easy to believe that an entire house is being haunted by a vampire because suddenly everyone is really pale and is wasting away. There's also the baseline fact that we don't know where life ends and death begins in this time period, right? We know that the heartbeat has something to do with it, but we don't have tools that help us hear the heart. The stethoscope, as we know it, and really the first stethoscope was basically like a cardboard tube that you would place on someone's chest, the same way you listen with a cup through a door, isn't invented until 1816 or 1817. So even hearing the heartbeat, we know that the pulse can get very slow, it can get very weak, it can get very soft, so soft that you can't necessarily feel it by touch or hear it by ear. There were fears of live burial at this time, and in fact, there were many, many reports of people thinking that they had buried a loved one alive, and you dig the loved one up, and they'd moved in their coffin. Right? It looks like they're wrapped tighter in their shroud now. They're clawing at their shroud, or there's even blood on the mouth. Perhaps that means your loved one was a vampire. Now, scientifically, we know that that is just part of rigor mortis, that the movements, the convulsions are part of what a body does. We get a little twitchy at a certain point after death. And also, they're not necessarily gently lowering these bodies into the ground or digging them up. And so getting someone just a little bit jostled in the coffin also happens. Also, when we die, we dry out. That means that our skin shrinks, our nails look longer, our teeth look longer, our hair looks a little more brittle than it did while we were alive. And people would take that as a sign that someone was a vampire. They dug up this body and suddenly it looked like they had grown fangs and claws. And so we have all of this scientific, again, quote unquote, evidence that there are actual vampires. As well as we move into the 19th century, out of the 18th and into the 19th century, real scientific evidence that the line between life and death can be unclear. What I've pulled up here is an excerpt from, let me butcher some French now that I've butchered some Greek, Julien Jean Césaire Lugarois' experiments on the principle of life, in which Lugarois was one of the first to postulate on the modular body, the idea that we don't need all of our organs, specifically all of our internal organs, to survive. Here he is carving off pieces of a rabbit's brainstem until its heart stops beating, basically, and is talking about how long an animal can live without part of its head, right? So we have experiments, actual men of science doing experiments on this. Also, Lugarois did these experiments in the 1780s. This is from an 1813 English translation. He would go on during the French Revolution to do some really interesting stuff with severed heads, because there were lots of severed heads laying around at that time in our history. So we're doing experiments on the fuzziness between life and death. We've got galvanism going on, where you hook bodies up to electrodes and make them jump. We've got the Royal Humane Society is founded in the 1770s. Originally, the Royal Society for the Rescue of Drowned Persons. We start having we start creating the techniques that we now know of today, is like the Heimlich maneuver and CPR, and the ability to rescue people who seem to be dead after they've drowned. And so there is this scientific gray space in which some people believe that vampires could exist, and some people just liked to imagine that vampires could exist. Now, we also have vampires in literature out of this time. We covered a lot of time with history. Now we're going to bounce back a little bit and look at literature. Der Vampire is one of the first pieces of vampiric literature. The way that we recognize vampiric literature today is Heinrich August Ossenfelder's 1748 poem. Very short, so I'll read it to you real quick. My dear young maiden clingeth, unbending fast and firm, to all the long-held teaching of a mother ever true, as in vampires unmortal folk on Theseus' portal. Hateth like do believe, but my Christine thou dost daily, and wilt my loving carry, till I myself avenging, to a vampire's help a-drinking, him toast in pale decay. And as softly thou art sleeping, to thee shall I come creeping, and thy life's blood drain away. So shalt thou be a-trembling, for thus shall I be kissing, and death's threshold thou crossing with fear in my cold arms. And last shall I be questioned, compared to such instruction, what are a mother's charms? So a very early vampire poem, German, obviously, we're reading an English translation. But we have it there. We've got our girl. Frequently our victims are female, even though in a lot of the original myths, the vampires themselves were female. That's another discussion. Anyway, so we've got a female victim, we've got the blood drinking, we've got the vampire coming in the night, right? These are our hallmarks of what we know of as vampire literature today. Some of the others, very famous ones in German, we've got Lenore by Gottfried August Bücher, maybe. I'm not sure. And then The Bride of Corinth, which is by Goethe, famous for writing The Sorrows of Young Werther. And then it makes its way into English in the 1800s. We've got Thalba the Destroyer by Robert Southey, a very famous English poet. Christabel by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was also widely considered to be Mary Shelley's godfather for all intents and purposes. One of her first great literary acts was to recite his Rime of the Ancient Mariner from memory when she was about 10. And then we have the Giaour by Byron. Lord Byron, George Gordon, Lord Byron. Now, Thalba and Christabel both kind of just hint at vampirism, right? We've got this wasting away, we've got the female victim, we don't have the blood and guts. Byron does go full blood and guts, as you can see from this excerpt from the Giaour. Basically, our enemy got away, enemy killed the two heroes, and now we're cursing him to become a vampire and destroy his own family. And this is the vampire that a lot of us will recognize, right? This is not a subtle creature. This is a creature that goes and destroys their own family. So, with all of that groundwork, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley is born in 1797. Now, Mary Shelley, to understand her, you have to understand her parents, or specifically her birth. Mary Shelley is the product of two of the greatest writers, the greatest literary minds of her time. Her father is William Godwin, who is a great political philosopher and novelist. Her mother is Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft was an early feminist, one of the great political writers and feminist writers of her time. Both of them, great minds, very, very outspoken, and very, very outspoken about their ideas of free love. They did not believe that people needed to enter into holy unions. They were fairly atheistic for their time. The idea of marriage was basically a constraint for both of them. So they start this relationship. They have this meeting with the minds. They get together. They do what they can to prevent pregnancy, but still Mary Wollstonecraft gets pregnant. Now, it's all very well and good to be practicing free love as long as no one gets pregnant, but suddenly someone is pregnant in the 1790s in London, and that is not something that they can stand, right? Mary Wollstonecraft would be destroyed. She already has one child by a previous lover. She had another child by a lover who's very obviously in the picture that she was not married to. It would absolutely destroy her. It would probably destroy William Godwin also. So when the rubber meets the road, they do end up getting married in the last months of Mary Wollstonecraft's pregnancy. Now, as I said, Mary Wollstonecraft already had another child. She had been through pregnancy once. She had been through pregnancy once on her own already. She was not worried about this. She felt healthy. She felt hale and hearty. She was very happy to be welcoming this child. She was fairly sure that this child was a son. And so when she goes into labor, they're not worried about it at all. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, our Mary, the one who would become Mary Shelley, is born on August 30th, 1797. That is her birthday. We in fact know the exact time. She was born about 8 p.m. at night. Her father recorded it in the journal that he wrote in every single day. 11 days later, on September 10th, 1797, this was his entry. 20 minutes before 8 and 3 blank lines. Mary Wollstonecraft died. 20 minutes to 8, 11 days after the birth of her daughter. She died in agony of a childbed fever. The surgeon who delivered our Mary Shelley, did not wash his hands before attending her. And so it was a terrible, terrible way to go. And Mary Shelley lived with that knowledge her entire life. Her father would never get over the death of her mother. He would remarry, mostly because now he suddenly had these 2 children, one of his own and one that was left to him by his wife, and they needed a mother. But Mary Shelley would grow up under the shadow of a massive portrait of Mary Wollstonecraft. One of the famous myths, probably true, about Mary Shelley is that she learned to write by tracing her mother's name on her tombstone. She would live literally in the shadow of this woman, grow up reading her work, grow up visiting her grave. her entire life. It's a very, very sad way to enter the world, right? As for her childhood, it was pretty good. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin does have some issues with her stepmother. There's a little bit of a kind of fairy tale evil stepmother thing going on there, but she has married another Mary. There are too many Marys in this story. Her father marries another Mary, who brings in 2 more children about Mary Shelley's age. They grow up in this big kind of messy household, everyone reading together, writing, debating together. She grows up, time goes on. We have governesses, we have education. She's an unusually well-educated girl for her time. Obviously, her father is this great philosopher. In 1814, Mary Shelley is sent off to Scotland to live with friends for a few months. And when she gets back, Percy Shelley, the poet, has come to study from her father. Percy Shelley was a radical poet and philosopher of his time. He wanted to be much more important than he was at this point. So he comes to study from William Godwin. He's a student of William Godwin. He brought his wife, his very pregnant wife, Harriet Shelley, with him, and very promptly falls in love with Mary Shelley. They meet in early spring, about March, I think, of 1814. In July, Mary, the woman who would become Mary Shelley, who at this point is Mary Godwin, and Percy Shelley, and Mary Godwin's stepsister Claire, because Claire was there for everything, elope to Europe. They go on a wild 6 weeks tour, including a time when they bought a donkey that was so broken down that they ended up carrying the donkey along with their own luggage. They are very, very broke by the time they crawl their way back to England, at which point Percy has to go beg his pregnant wife for money to pay off their debts. That is the way that Mary Shelley's relationship, one of the most storied relationships of the early 19th century, starts, is with this fairly catastrophic honeymoon. Now, Percy Shelley, having read Godwin and Wollstonecraft, is trying to practice free love. He's very bad at it, mostly because his wife is not on board for this. She is not on with the idea of having a sister wife. Shelley and Mary spend the next couple of years in London. They're dodging debtors. Mary Shelley gets pregnant for the first time and loses her first baby in this time. There's a very famous passage from her journal that is frequently quoted as it's part of the inspiration for Frankenstein. The baby is born a couple of months premature, and so it only lives for a few days. And after this, Mary Shelley has this dream where she says, I had a dream, and she writes, I had a dream in which my child was just cold. We warmed it by the fire and it woke up. And so people interpret this as being part of the reason that she would go on to write Frankenstein. All of this happens, and then we get to 1816. We've had enough of London. We've had enough of money troubles. Percy and Mary and Claire decide that they're going to tour the continent again. Specifically, they're going to go to Geneva. Now, Claire Claremont and Lord Byron at this point had at least been talking. Maybe they had been liaising in other ways too at this point, but Claire definitely wanted to join Byron in Geneva, and so she convinces Mary and Percy that they need to go. Harriet Shelley, Percy's first wife, is still alive at this point and raising his children. But Mary is going by Mary Shelley by now. By the time they are on the continent, the people that they meet think that she is Percy's legal wife. She is called Mrs. Shelley frequently. 1816, another famous postmark in Mary Shelley lore. This is the year without summer. In 1815, Mount Tambor, I believe it is, yes, in Indonesia, erupted, sending enough pyroclastic material into the atmosphere to cool the continent of Europe by anywhere from 2 to 4 degrees. This was 1816 was the year without summer. It was cold, it was rainy, crops did not grow. For a lot of people, this was very, very bad. For people of the class that Mary and Percy Shelley are moving in, it was mildly inconvenient, and it meant that when they tried to go sailing on Lake Geneva, a lot of times they got rained out. Now, on one of these long rainy evenings, Mary, Percy Shelley, Lord Byron's personal physician, John Polidori, and Claire Claremont are reading German ghost stories together and come up with the idea to have our own ghost story writing contest, right? Between the 6 of us, we're all gonna write ghost stories and then we're gonna see who did the best one. This contest is very quickly dropped. Anyone who has tried to make really cool plans with your friends that end up being more complicated than you thought knows how this goes, right? But the product of this is Mary Shelley starts writing Frankenstein. This is the origin, the true origin of Frankenstein. Byron starts writing something that looks like a vampire story, but he really only writes about a chapter and then talks about it a bit and puts it away and never finishes it. John William Polidori, his doctor, would later on go to take Byron's idea and write his own vampire story. His story is more of an energy vampire. It's called The Vampire, and it is cited as the first vampire novel in English. But it's an energy vampire. We're not really sucking blood. We're just corrupting women and eventually killing them, but not necessarily, thanks to next type thing. 1816 happens. The Shelleys come back to England. They live there for a while. 1817. Mary Shelley gives birth to her first child that lives. Yes, in September we've got Clara is born, the first daughter that she has that lives. Now between Clara's birth in 1817 and their arrival back in England in September of 1816, Fanny Henley, Mary Shelley's sister by Mary Wollstonecraft, would commit suicide. Harriet Shelley, Percy's first wife, would also commit suicide. The consequence of that being that now Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley can legally be wed. They would do this mostly to try and gain custody of his children by Harriet. This does not work. Her family strongly objects, and so they never gain custody of those children. But Mary does give birth to Clara. She also finishes Frankenstein, and in January of 1818, Frankenstein is published anonymously, but with a foreword by Percy Shelley, which meant that a lot of people thought he wrote it. There's this whole big thing with him having to say, no, I promise it wasn't me, it was my wife. And everyone's like, your wife? There were mixed reviews on it. Some people thought it was very clever. Some people did not. We'll look at one of those reviews in a second. In March of 1818, Mary and Percy Shelley would pack up their household and they would leave England. They would say, we're done with this. All right, we're tired of the scandal. We're tired of being poor, because they kind of were. They were wealthy poor, but they were dealing with debts. They would leave England forever. This is a review that came out in April of 1818, so just after they left Frankenstein. Remember, Mary Shelley's only about 19 when this book is published, and so a 19-year-old who has written something that we now know of as one of the most revolutionary pieces of literature one of the most revolutionary pieces of British literature, receives this. This is just the last paragraph of a very long review. Saying, we need scarcely say that these volumes have neither principal, object, nor moral. The horror which abounds in them is too grotesque and bizarre ever to approach near the sublime. And when we did not hurry over the pages in disgust, we sometimes paused to laugh outright, and yet we suspect that the diseased and wandering imagination, which had stepped out of all legitimate bounds to frame these disjointed combinations and unnatural adventures, might be disciplined into something better. We heartily wish it were so, for there are occasional symptoms of no common powers of minds, struggling through a mass of absurdity which well nigh overwhelms them. But it is a sort of absurdity that approaches so often the confines of what is wicked and immoral, that we dare hardly trust ourselves to bestow even this qualified phrase. The writer of it is, we understand, a female. This is an aggravation of that which is the prevailing fault of the novel. But if our authoress can forget the gentleness of her sex, there's no reason why we should. We shall therefore dismiss the novel without further comment. This is how Mary Shelley's first novel is greeted by the British public, okay? That's a hard thing. As a novelist, I can tell you reviews are terrifying, and deep, visceral reviews like that, horrifying. So 1818, they leave, and there is a part of Mary Shelley, though she would return to Frankenstein several times, that kind of seems to say good riddance to this new page, new chapter in her life. Now, 1818 to 1822, we're moving around Europe, mostly Italy, always looking for a cheaper situation. Percy Shelley frequently had debts. He was really good at spending money, not good at saving money. Now, he was the son of a baronet. He was the heir to a baronetcy. He knew that someday he would inherit a bunch of money, so he frequently took out loans against his inheritance. He would take out these mortgages saying that I promised, my dad's old, he's gonna die, I'm gonna inherit it, I'm young and healthy. Don't worry, I'll be able to pay this back once Sir Timothy Shelley dies. Remember that, we will come back to it. Between 1818 and 1822, there are some good times. There are also a lot of heartache. In September of 1818, Clara Shelley, Mary Shelley's first daughter, dies. In June of 1819, her son, William, who she nicknamed Will Mouse, also dies. Her niece, Claremont's daughter, her sister's daughter by Byron, Allegra, dies in 1822. And Mary Shelley also loses two children, at least two children, to miscarriage that we know of. There are some gaps in the journal that make us think that there might be more. This was a very, very tough time emotionally for Mary Shelley. With a husband who, while he met her on an intellectual level, was not always able to meet her on an emotional level. There's one point where she has a miscarriage in Naples, and he turns up a couple of days later with an orphan child that he has adopted and tries to say, look, I replaced it, which does not go well. This is an experiment that ends very badly and a scandal that would follow them later on. In November of 1819, she does give birth to Percy Florence Shelley, the only child that she has who would survive. Percy Shelley does survive both of his parents. He does eventually inherit his grandfather's estate, and he does live a wealthy life. Good on him. He apparently loved photography and writing very bad dramas, and would like have theaters. So there is that happy silver lining, but we've got a long way to go before we get there. In July of 1822, Percy Shelley dies. See, do I have it? And things get hard. Okay, Percy Shelley dies in a very needless boating accident. He wasn't a good sailor. He sailed out into a storm and drowned. That's what happened. There's a lot of poetic ways to do this. There are paintings about it. There are poems about it. He made a stupid mistake and storm and drowned, like the ocean, the sea winds, usually. But things get hard for Mary Shelley because now she is a woman on her own with her husband's debts and a child and no real way to support herself. Frankenstein sold those initial 500 copies that were published, but she's been working on a novel since then, but she doesn't have anything else. Percy never sold much poetry, even though he would go on to be this great beloved poet. There are not extensive coffers to keep her sustained, even in Italy, which is a relatively cheap place to live at this time. Enter the father-in-law, Sir Timothy Shelley, who lives way too long. Now, Percy Shelley's children by Harriet, his first children, have also, well, his son has died, his daughter has not died yet. But Mary Shelley's son, Percy Florence, is the heir apparent to Sir Timothy Shelley. And so she's in negotiations with him. She's like, this is your heir. Is there any way that you will support your heir to make sure that he doesn't starve between now and the time when you die? And Timothy Shelley's response is, sure, send him to me. I'll take care of it. That's fine. And Mary Shelley has no desire to part with this last vestige of her husband, of her life with Percy Shelley. Timothy Shelley would live way, way too long. He would live to the ripe old age of whatever 1844 minus 1753 is, which is very old for that time. If we'll jump back to Mary Shelley's, she only lives to the 1850s, so she only outlives him by a few years. And only gets to enjoy the fruits of this inheritance at the very end of her life. So we have an uncooperative father-in-law, we have bills that need to be paid, we have a small child that needs to be fed. Mary Shelley decides that she's going to support herself. She's been working on Valperga for a long time. This is her second novel. This is a novel about medieval Florentine, Italian politics. It is very complicated. Don't ask, like, it's interesting, it's fascinating, it's also complicated. Don't ask me what the plot is. So she's been working on that. She decides to go ahead and hurry up and finish that off. But while she's finishing that off, she writes this short story, A Tale of Passions, that was published in the Liberal magazine that is edited and published by their friends, the Hunts, in 1822. And here is where we finally get to Mary Shelley and vampires. It's been a long road coming, I know. But here we are, Mary Shelley and vampires. She publishes this little short story. She publishes Valperga, and then eventually she does leave for England. But the passions, our vampirism is very, very subtle. We've got two little bits. Now, in the passions, all right, see if I can pronounce these names. We've got the Guelphs and the Siblings. All right, cool. Warring factions in Italy. Some are German, some aren't. We've got this whole power struggle thing going on. At one point in this story, we have a young woman dressed as a young man who's going around trying to encourage former allies to side a certain way. It doesn't really matter, but one of these allies had formerly betrayed them, and now we have his internal motivation. If you'll look over to the far side, he had sworn never to sleep on a bed or drink aught but water until his first cup of wine was mingled with the blood of Manfred. He had fulfilled this vow. A strange alteration had worked within him from the moment he had drained that unholy cup. The spirit not of a man but of a devil, which seemed to live within him, urging him to crime, from which his long protracted hope of more complete revenge had alone deterred him. So, we are consuming blood, right? We do have that bit of vampirism, even if it is mingled with wine. And then at the end of the story, he has taken this young woman captive, and this is our last glimpse of her before another character is executed, basically. She had endured much, for when, as Corradino advanced to the front of the scaffold, the litter being placed opposite it, Lostentendardo, who is our guy who drank the wine, ordered the curtains to be withdrawn. The white hand that hung inanimate from the side was thin as a winter leaf, and her fair face, pillowed by the thick knots of her dark hair, was sunken and ashy pale, while you could see the deep blue of her eyes struggle through closed lids. And so we have our female victim who is wasted away, right? That is another hallmark of vampirism. We've got our drinker of blood, and we've got our woman who goes and is wasted away. Again, this is very subtle, but it's subtle enough. Actually, I've got a friend who is doing her PhD on vampires, and she says this is a vampirism. Like, there's not teeth on necks, it's not a vampire. This is for you, Mer. Welcome, Desmond. But we do have the consumption of blood. We do have the wasting away of an innocence. We do have the recurrence of vows and curses. This is another part of vampiric lore, whether they're bound by a promise or vampirism itself is used as a curse. And we have an author who is going through her own long, dark night of the soul. She's a woman desperate to make it on her own and as an author in a world that she knew would be unkind to her. And this is what she turned to at that time. Just because Mary Shelley's monsters weren't always obvious as Frankenstein is, or as Frankenstein's creature is, does not mean that they're not always there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Hold on. We have some time for questions before we go downstairs and hand out candy to children. If anyone has a question, I have one, so I'm happy to ask mine out of sort of moderator privilege as it were. Could you go back to the previous slide? Sure. Thank you. I'm just curious on that that mingling of wine with blood, and like, do we know about? I guess she has a pretty extensive diary, but do we know much about her kind of religious identity through all of this, if any? Because I mean, is that meant to be an inversion of the Eucharist? That notion?
It could well be an inversion of the Eucharist. So Mary Shelley, at this point, while she was with Percy, like she claimed to be an atheist, probably wasn't exactly. After Percy dies, especially after she gets back to England, she has to suddenly become respectable hard. Because again, she's got a kid to put through school, she's got books that she wants to sell. So she would become at least very performatively religious once she gets back to England. Now, this was probably written in 1822, published in 23. So at this point, she is very familiar with the pieces of religion of the Eucharist. They were very curious about Catholicism in Italy while they were around. They made a habit of touring cathedrals, etc. Whether she was an active believer at this point, being kind of up for debate. She does have an extensive diary. She figured out after one too many servants stole her diary and tried to sell it to get very, very cagey with her entries. So it's not like she's going to be riding around like, today is an atheist.
Right.
So.
I was just because in the mass you would mingle wine with water every time. I'm just thinking. Other questions from people that aren't me? Jake.
Sorry, I think I missed it, but how did she die?
So Mary Shelley lives until she's in her 50s. She dies of what we think now is probably a brain cancer. We know that she lost sight. We know that she had terrible splitting headaches towards the end of her life, and a lot of people diagnosed that as a tumor.
Sure. Yeah, she had a tail of woe her whole life.
Oh, her whole life, it was hard. Yeah.
Other questions? Anything else you want to think? I've got another one while you think. This is unrelated to the vampirism. When did Frankenstein as a novel become the popular Frankenstein we're familiar with? Like when was it recognized as a classic? Was it not in her life?
So as a classic, not so much, but within her lifetime, she actually saw it become this cultural phenomenon. She comes back to England in 1822, and one of the first things she does is go to a play of Frankenstein.
Oh, wow.
And a play that actually has a lot of the tropes that we know of today from our movies, like this bumbling lab assistant, the Igor character that we know today was Fritz. He was French, obviously. It was bumbling around as the comedic relief. The "It's Alive" scene, not in the book, is in this first play.
Okay.
And so we get these really early tropes that we would later associate with Frankenstein. So it was well known. And in 1830, she did go on to do a republished edition that took out a lot of the atheistic stuff. Because again, we're being more religious by that time period in her writing. She would see it be popular. It was not until like the 1970s that we really started thinking of it as worthy of study, rather than just this kind of interesting little science fiction piece of work.
At least she saw it get popular.
But she did see it get popular, yes.
Was she compensated for them using her book for the play?
No, not at all. That was not a thing.
That sucks.
It does suck, yes, no, because there were lots of bootleg translations into French and German, and Italian. There were bootleg copies that were like shipped to America, and printers there were publishing it, and she did not see any of that, yeah.
The history of copywriting and such is actually oddly fascinating, really,
Oh,
is the
it's-
struggles that artists had to try to get compensated.
Mhm.
What's your opinion on the Vampire Diaries?
So I have not watched the Vampire Diaries. I read the first book when I was a teenager, when they were being marketed towards me. I remember thinking that they were really interesting. This friend who studies the vampires is fascinated by the Vampire Diaries and by Twilight specifically. Like her work is on 20th and 21st century vampires and the way that that has added to the myth. And so her opinion is that it has added really interesting things to the kind of common vampire lore. I don't know enough to make that comment. But
It's good, you should watch it.
There we go. Vampire Horseman of the Sparkly Vampires.
no, that's Twilight. Twilight is sparkly vampires. Vampire Diaries vampires are not sparkly and do burn up in the sun, right? I remember that. Sometimes. Okay.
Okay.
Alright.
What was the one that Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise were in back in the 90s?
That is Interview with the Vampire. Anne Rice.
That was Anne, yeah, I remember that.
Yes.
I'm older. Yes. Other questions? Anything else for Dr. DeBie?
Yes.
When and why do you think that the vampires here like kind of transformed into the more modern, like bad, blood-sucking, murder happy kind of vampires?
So, vampires across the 19th century, when I say 19th century, I mean 1800s, just so everyone knows, have these like really bright spots. So we've got Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu in the 1770s. That is this fascinating like lesbian vampire thriller thing. And then we've got Dracula, of course, that comes out in the 1898, 97, someone, very, very end of the 19th century. And that's where we get a lot of our vampire, what we think of as vampires today, myth, and legend. The idea of us staking them through the heart, the idea that they need their grave dirt to have their power of sleeping during the daytime. One male vampire with this kind of harem of female vampires following him around. All of that really was collated with Dracula. And then in the 20th century, some of the earliest film franchises that we have are the Hammer horror movies with Dracula, first an adaptation of Dracula, and then like these further adventures of the vampire. And so that's kind of where the 20th century version of the vampire really takes off, is when Hollywood takes this very British vampire and is like, yeah, Americanized. Yeah.
So is the energy vampire you spoke about earlier, is that the forerunner of Colin Robinson from What We Do in the Shadows?
Yes, that is exactly what he was doing. Yeah, it's the idea of not necessarily a vampire that sucks your blood, but a vampire that just makes you feel weaker and weaker. Yeah, pretty much.
Any last questions before we, one more from our night?
I was curious, where did the trope of vampires can't come into your home unless they're welcome to come from?
So that, let's see, is it in Carmilla? I don't think it's in Carmilla. I can hear, I'm sending this to the friend who does the PhD, and she's going to be shouting at me, not looking this over out of hand. I know that in Dracula, you can't come into his, or he cannot come into your house until you invite him. Because that's a whole big thing.
In Vampire Diaries, it's like that, like you have to be welcome and.
Yeah.
Don't let anyone in your house, just.
Yes, exactly. So we should all have unwelcome signs on our doors just to be safe. Now where Dracula got that from, not Dracula, Stoker, Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula, I'm not sure. He was Irish. And that's a thing that you get in Irish mythology, specifically in Irish fairy mythology, is that you have to invite fairies into your home in order for them to come in and do mischief. So if he was stealing from that to create Dracula, or if there was some other legend, bless you, that he's working on, or if he just decided like this would make a really tense scene, because it does. There's this scene at night where he's trying to convince this girl to invite him into her house so that he can physically attack her, like he's been mentally attacking her for a while, but he can't physically attack her yet. So there's also a chance that Stoker was like, this would make a great plot point. You know,
Yeah.
girl. So.
Awesome. All right, well, let's thank Dr. DeBie once again. Thank you. Okay, on the internet for folks who missed it, we don't have any questions in the chat, so that's good. And stop.